Ethan Caldwell had built an empire on precision. Every decision he made, every calculated risk he took, had been meticulously planned. That was how he turned a fledgling tech startup into a Silicon Valley powerhouse worth billions. But tonight, as he sat in the back of a sleek black town car winding through the dimly lit streets of Brooklyn, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in: restlessness. He leaned his head against the cool leather seat, exhaling slowly. He was supposed to be at a corporate gala, shaking hands with investors, indulging in hollow conversations about stock valuations and industry trends. Instead, he had told his driver to take him anywhere but Manhattan. He needed space, the illusion of normalcy. The car pulled up in front of a small, unassuming restaurant on the corner of a quiet street. Vincent's, the sign read in old-fashioned script. Ethan had no idea why he chose this place, only that it was the opposite of the world he inhabited. A world of penthouses, private jets, and Michelin-starred dining. Inside, the scent of grilled steak and warm bread filled the air. The place was cozy, bustling with families, couples, and the occasional solo diner. The chatter was casual, the laughter genuine. It was a stark contrast to the hushed, curated sophistication he was used to. Here, no one whispered his name in recognition. No one glanced up to gauge his net worth. He was anonymous, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like a relief. Ethan took a seat near the window, glancing at the menu, though he had no real appetite. His mind was elsewhere, on the pile of emails waiting for him, the crisis brewing in his company, and the gnawing emptiness he could never quite explain. A waitress approached, a tired smile on her face. "What can I get you?" "A steak, medium rare, and a glass of red." She scribbled on her pad, then walked off. Ethan leaned back, rolling his sleeves up slightly, rubbing his temple. He had built his life on control, yet tonight, for the first time in years, he was simply letting the world move around him. It was unsettling and oddly freeing at the same time. Then he heard it. A quiet, trembling sob. He turned instinctively, scanning the room until his gaze landed on a small figure near the counter. A little girl sat on the floor, tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped her face with small fists. She couldn't have been older than 4, dark curls tumbling around her face. Even from across the room he could see the startling brightness of her blue eyes. His blue eyes. Something in his chest tightened, a sensation he didn't quite understand. He wasn't the type of man who got involved in the problems of strangers. He wasn't the kind who paused his life for someone, outside his world. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself pushing back his chair and standing. He crossed the room in a few strides, crouching down beside her carefully, making sure not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him, her tear-streaked cheeks quivering. I'm lost." Ethan felt a surprising pang of concern. He had expected to hear something like, "I dropped my toy," or "I spilled my juice." But lost. That was different. That was something he understood all too well, even if he'd never admit it. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. She hesitated before wiping her nose with her sleeve. "Mia." "Mia. That's a beautiful name," Ethan murmured. "Where's your mom?" Mia's lower lip wobbled again, and she shook her head. "She was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back, but I couldn't find her." Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the restaurant for a panicked mother. No one seemed to be searching frantically, which only made his concern grow. "Your mom works here," he guessed. Mia nodded. "She's a waitress." That confirmed it. Her mother had likely stepped away for a moment, expecting Mia to stay put. Instead, she had wandered off, just far enough to feel lost in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Ethan wasn't sure why, but the thought unsettled him. He could have called a waitress over. He could have let someone else handle it and gone back to his untouched glass of wine. But something about the girl's wide, frightened eyes kept him in place. "All right," he said, offering a small nod. "Let's find her together, okay?" Mia hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of it surprised him. He wasn't used to holding something so small, so delicate. It felt unfamiliar and yet grounding. As they walked together through the restaurant, scanning faces and waiting for recognition to spark, Ethan had no idea that this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant decision, was about to change his life forever. Ethan's grip on Mia's tiny hand tightened slightly as they weaved between tables. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the vulnerability in her bright blue eyes, or the unsettling familiarity they sparked within him. A sudden voice cut through the murmur of the restaurant. "Mia!" Mia gasped, her head snapping up toward the far end of the restaurant. A woman rushed toward them, weaving through tables with a frantic urgency that made Ethan's chest tighten. She was breathless, her dark brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, an apron tied around her waist. Her face was a mix of panic and relief as she dropped to her knees and pulled Mia into her arms. Ethan took a step back, allowing them space, but something about the scene felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the woman's relief or the way Mia clung to her. It was her. Sophia Reed. For a moment he thought he was imagining it. The years had changed her. Her face was a little leaner, her features a little softer. But there was no mistaking the deep brown eyes that locked onto his with a mix of disbelief and something else. Something raw. "Ethan." His name left her lips in a whisper, as if she was afraid saying it too loudly would shatter the moment. The restaurant, the noise, the people. It all faded into the background. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. Hadn't expected to ever see her again, and yet, here she was, holding a little girl who had his eyes. A rush of understanding, followed by something dangerously close to rage, surged through him. Ethan's voice was lower than usual when he spoke, controlled but edged with something sharp. "Tell me the truth, Sophia." His gaze flickered down to Mia, who was clutching her mother's apron, then back up. "Is she mine?" Sophia's lips parted, her eyes searching his as if there were 1,000 things she wanted to say, but in the end she only gave him the one answer that mattered. "Yes." The single word sent Ethan's world into free fall. Ethan's world narrowed to a pinpoint as Sophia's confirmation echoed in his mind. Yes. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background. The warmth of the dim lighting, the hum of laughter, the scent of grilled steak and fresh bread, all of it ceased to exist. All that remained was the woman standing in front of him and the child clutching her hand. His child. 1,000 thoughts crashed into him, each one more overwhelming than the last. 4 years. He had a daughter for 4 years, and no one had told him. No one had given him the chance to know her, to love her, to be her father. Rage bubbled beneath the surface, sharp and raw, but underneath that, something even more terrifying: loss. Ethan took a slow, controlled breath, his voice tightening as he fought for composure. "How long have you known?" Sophia's grip on Mia's small hand tightened, her jaw set, but there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "Since the moment I found out I was pregnant." His stomach twisted. "And you didn't think I had a right to know?" Sophia swallowed hard. "It wasn't that simple, Ethan." His lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not complicated either. I deserve to know my own daughter." Mia looked between them, her small brows furrowing, sensing the tension despite not understanding the depth of it. She tugged at Sophia's apron. "Mommy?" Sophia knelt down, smoothing Mia's hair, her voice softer now. "It's okay, sweetheart." Ethan took in the way she soothed the little girl, the way Mia leaned into her instinctively. He had missed this. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every moment of laughter and tears. The weight of those lost years hit him like a freight train. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lower now. "Alone." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Mia, why don't you go sit at the counter? I'll be right there." Mia glanced up at Ethan again, her curious blue eyes holding his for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she let go of Sophia's hand and skipped over to the counter, where an older waitress immediately engaged her in conversation. The second Mia was out of earshot, Ethan turned back to Sophia. "Why?" Sophia sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. "Because I was scared, Ethan. You were so consumed by work, by Caldwell Tech. You were flying across the world, making billion-dollar deals, building an empire. I didn't want to trap you." Ethan's chest tightened. "You don't get to decide what I would have wanted." Her eyes flashed. "No? You were barely present then. What would have changed?" His jaw clenched. "Everything." Silence stretched between them. Sophia's expression softened, just for a moment before she looked away. "I wasn't trying to punish you. I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "You kept her from me. You decided I wasn't capable of being her father before I even had a chance." Sophia looked away. "Maybe I was afraid you wouldn't want to be." That hit deeper than he cared to admit. His entire life had been about control, about success. He had told himself for years that his sacrifices, the relationships left behind, the friendships abandoned, were necessary, that in the end, they were worth it. But standing here now, looking at the woman he had once loved and the daughter he had never met, he wasn't so sure anymore. Ethan exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I'm not walking away." Sophia's gaze snapped back to his. "Ethan!" "I mean it." His voice was firm now. "You don't get to keep me from her anymore." Sophia's shoulders sagged, a weary look passing over her face. "I wouldn't do that. Not now." A moment of silence passed. Neither of them knew where to go from here, how to navigate the chasm of years between them. Finally, Sophia sighed. "She doesn't know who you are. I never told her." The words struck him like a blow. His own daughter didn't even know he existed. He swallowed the sharp pain that rose in his throat and nodded slowly. "Then we start there." Sophia studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay." Ethan glanced toward the counter, where Mia was happily chatting with the waitress, oblivious to the storm that had just begun to unfold. His heart clenched as he watched her, knowing he had so much to make up for. He wasn't sure what the future looked like now. But one thing was certain. He wasn't letting go of it. Not again. Ethan sat in his car outside Vincent's for far too long, staring through the windshield as customers came and went. Inside, Sophia was finishing her shift, moving through the restaurant with a grace that had once been so familiar to him. But now, everything felt foreign. Mia was his daughter. That truth rang in his mind, unrelenting, louder than any business negotiation or financial forecast ever had. He had spent years thinking he had everything: power, success, control. But in reality, he had been oblivious to the most important thing of all: his daughter. Ethan exhaled, forcing himself out of the car. He wasn't the type to hesitate, but this wasn't a boardroom where logic dictated every move. This was personal. This was fragile. As he stepped back inside, Sophia was gathering her things behind the counter. She looked up at him, wary. "You're still here." Ethan nodded. "I meant what I said. I'm not walking away." She sighed, pulling her purse over her shoulder. "Ethan, this isn't something you can just decide overnight. Mia doesn't know you. I want to change that." Sophia studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay, but we do this my way." He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. He was used to control, used to making decisions. But right now, he had none. "And what does your way look like?" Sophia led him outside, where the cool night air wrapped around them. You can't just drop into her life and expect her to understand. She doesn't need a father she barely knows suddenly upending everything. Ethan swallowed the sting of her words. He had already missed everything. He wasn't going to waste another second. "Then tell me how to do this." Sophia hesitated before letting out a breath. "We start small. She knows you as the man who helped her, and for now, that's enough. I won't confuse her with anything more until I know you're serious about being in her life." Ethan's brows furrowed. "You think I'm not serious?" Sophia turned, her expression unreadable. "I think you've never had to put anyone else before your career, Ethan. And I need to know that's changed." The words cut deep because she wasn't wrong. His life had been nothing but work, ambition, and drive. But none of it mattered now, not in the way Mia did. "So what do you propose?" he asked. Sophia crossed her arms. "You start by spending time with her, as a friend, no pressure, no sudden declarations." Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted more than that, wanted to claim his place in Mia's life fully, but he knew he had to earn it. "Fine. What's the first step?" Sophia glanced at her phone. "We go to the park tomorrow. If she takes to you, we'll go from there." Ethan gave a sharp nod. He wasn't walking away from this. "I'll be there." The next morning, Ethan found himself in an unfamiliar place, a quiet green park, far removed from the skyscrapers and power plays of his world. It was early, and parents were scattered across the playground, their children laughing as they ran across the grass. Sophia arrived with Mia in tow, the little girl bouncing with excitement, unaware of the undercurrents between the adults. When she spotted Ethan, she hesitated for a brief second before beaming. "You came!" Ethan felt something shift in his chest. "Of course." Mia tilted her head. "Did you bring a book?" He blinked, thrown off by the question. "A book?" Sophia, standing beside her, smirked. "She's obsessed with stories." Ethan let out a breath and pulled a small hardcover from his coat pocket. "I didn't know which one you'd like, so I guessed." Mia's eyes widened as she grabbed it from his hands. "You brought Dragons and Knights. I love this book." Ethan glanced at Sophia, who looked equally surprised. "Lucky guess." Mia plopped onto a nearby bench, patting the seat beside her. "Read to me." He hesitated, glancing at Sophia for permission. She gave a small nod, but there was caution in her eyes. He took a seat beside Mia, flipping open the book. As he read, Mia leaned in closer, captivated by the story. Halfway through, she reached out and touched his sleeve. "You sound like a knight." Ethan swallowed, his throat unexpectedly tight. "Do I?" Mia nodded solemnly. "Yep, a real one." Sophia watched them, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Ethan had spent years closing deals with some of the most powerful people in the world, yet here he was, completely undone by a 4-year-old's quiet words. By the time they reached the last page, Mia yawned, resting her head against his arm. Ethan froze. The small weight of her was unfamiliar, and yet it felt right. Sophia cleared her throat, pulling Mia gently away. "Time to go, sweetheart." Mia stretched but then turned to Ethan. "Will you come again?" Ethan met Sophia's gaze. There was a warning there, but also something else, reluctant acceptance. He smiled at Mia. "Yeah, I'll be here." Mia beamed, grabbing her mother's hand. As they walked away, Ethan stood there for a long moment, the warmth of her small head still lingering against his sleeve. He had closed 1,000 deals in his life, won every battle he had fought. But this was something else entirely. This was the start of something he wouldn't lose. Ethan had always believed that success came at a price. He had made peace with the sacrifices long ago, the sleepless nights, the strained relationships, the loneliness that came with being at the top. It had never bothered him, not until now. Sitting in his corner office, surrounded by towering glass windows that overlooked the Manhattan skyline, he felt something gnaw at him. It wasn't the usual pressure of an impending acquisition or an investor call. It was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Mia. Her small, eager face had lingered in his thoughts all morning, her bright blue eyes watching him expectantly as he read to her at the park. The way she had leaned against him without hesitation, as if she had already accepted him before he had even earned it. That simple trust was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. And now he couldn't stop thinking about what came next. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Oliver Gray, his longtime friend and CFO, stepped inside, looking at him with a smirk. "That's the third time I've walked in here and caught you staring at nothing. Something on your mind?" Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Nothing that concerns the company." Oliver raised an eyebrow and took a seat across from him. "So, something personal then?" Ethan remained silent, tapping his fingers against the desk. Oliver was one of the few people who knew him beyond his business persona, and yet the words felt foreign in his mouth. "I have a daughter." He hadn't said it out loud yet, not to anyone, as if saying it would make it more real than it already was. After a beat, he finally admitted, "There's something I need to figure out." Oliver studied him before nodding. "It's about the woman from years ago, isn't it?" Ethan stiffened. Oliver had been there when Ethan had first met Sophia, when things had been different. He had seen how Ethan had buried himself in work, even when she had tried to pull him away from it. And now Oliver was looking at him like he already knew what Ethan had just discovered. "She has a daughter," Ethan said quietly. Oliver blinked. "A daughter?" Ethan met his gaze, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "My daughter." Oliver let out a low whistle, running a hand through his dark hair. "Well, that's unexpected." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what are you going to do about it?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I'm going to be in her life." Oliver nodded slowly. "And what about work?" The question hit him harder than it should have. His company had been his entire life, but suddenly it wasn't enough. "I'll figure it out," Ethan said, though even he wasn't sure what that meant yet. Oliver smirked. "I'll believe that when I see it." That evening, Ethan arrived at Sophia's apartment, a brownstone in a quieter part of the city. He had never been here before, had never thought to wonder where she had built her life. But as he stood in front of the door, a thought struck him. He had never been part of this life. Sophia answered a moment later, her gaze wary. "You're early." Ethan shrugged. "I wanted to be." Sophia sighed and stepped aside. The apartment was small but warm, filled with small signs of a life well lived. A bookshelf overflowing with children's books, framed drawings on the fridge, a cozy couch with a handmade blanket draped over the back. "Where's Mia?" he asked. "In her room, changing," Sophia replied. "She insisted on wearing her favorite dress for this." Ethan's lips twitched slightly at that. He had expected hesitation, but Mia had welcomed him without question. That only made him more determined not to let her down. Sophia crossed her arms, watching him. "You can still change your mind, you know." He met her gaze. "That's not happening." A beat of silence passed before she finally nodded. "Okay." A moment later, Mia came skipping out of her room, her dress a bright shade of yellow, a plastic tiara perched slightly askew on her head. When she saw him, she beamed. "You're here!" Ethan crouched down slightly, leveling himself with her. "Of course, I wouldn't miss it." Mia reached out and took his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the couch. "Can we play a game before dinner?" Ethan glanced at Sophia, who simply nodded. He let Mia lead him to a small table where an assortment of crayons and coloring books were scattered. "I'm making a picture for you," Mia announced, picking up a blue crayon, "but you have to color too." Ethan hesitated, then picked up a crayon. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something so simple, so human. As he colored, Sophia sat nearby, watching him closely. He knew what she was thinking, whether he would disappear, whether this was temporary. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, not looking up. Sophia exhaled, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. "We'll see," Mia hummed as she colored, oblivious to the tension between them. When she finished, she held up her drawing proudly. It was a picture of 3 stick figures, all holding hands. One had long brown hair, the other had dark curls, and the tallest one had blue eyes just like hers. "This is me and Mommy and you," she declared. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. His name had been on buildings, on contracts, in the headlines, but never like this, never in crayon, in the hands of a little girl who already saw him as part of her world. Sophia met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but for the first time, there was something softer there, something that told him maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe he meant it. Ethan reached out, gently tapping Mia's nose. "I love it." Mia grinned. "Good. 'Cause I'm making more." Ethan chuckled, feeling something inside him settle. This was new, unfamiliar, uncharted territory, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. He was exactly where he needed to be. Ethan hadn't realized how much his life had changed until he found himself at his office, staring blankly at a document on his screen. His assistant had already knocked twice to remind him of his upcoming meeting with investors, but his mind wasn't on business. It was on Mia, on Sophia, on the life he had never been part of. For years, Ethan had thought he understood success. It was numbers, negotiations, deals that shaped the world. But now, sitting in his high-rise office, all he could think about was the little girl who had drawn a picture of their family in crayon. He barely noticed when Oliver walked in, hands stuffed into his pockets, studying him carefully before speaking. "So, are you actually going to focus on work today? Or should I just move all your meetings to next week?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Not in the mood, Oliver." His friend smirked. "That's a first." He sat down across from Ethan, his expression shifting to something more serious. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" Ethan didn't bother denying it. "I spent years thinking I had control over everything, but I had no idea about the most important thing in my life." Oliver nodded. "I get it. But if you want to be in your daughter's life, you need to find balance. You've built an empire, Ethan. You can't just walk away from that overnight." Ethan exhaled. "I'm not walking away, but I'm not letting work take priority over Mia." Oliver tilted his head. "And Sophia?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's different." "Is she?" Oliver leaned forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, she's the one who decides how much access you have to your daughter. And if you want to be in Mia's life, you need to earn Sophia's trust first." Ethan hated how right Oliver was. He had never been one to ask for permission, had never needed to prove himself to anyone. But this wasn't a business deal. This was about his daughter. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at the restaurant where Sophia worked. He had debated calling first, but deep down he knew that if he wanted to prove he was serious, he had to show up. Sophia spotted him as she was wiping down a table. Her eyes narrowed slightly, wary but not surprised. "Ethan," he nodded. "Can we talk?" She hesitated before nodding toward the back. 5 minutes. They stepped outside into the crisp night air. Sophia crossed her arms, waiting. "What is it?" Ethan took a breath. "I want to do this right. I want to be in Mia's life, but I also know that means proving myself to you." Sophia's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't let her guard down. "You've always been married to your work, Ethan. That hasn't changed." "I'm trying," he said. "I don't have all the answers, but I'm not the same person I was back then." Sophia studied him for a long moment. "Then prove it." "How?" She exhaled. "Mia has a school event next weekend. She's been excited about it for weeks. Show up." Ethan straightened. "I will." Sophia nodded, but there was still doubt in her eyes. "We'll see." Ethan didn't say anything else. He knew words weren't enough. Next weekend, he would show her exactly how much Mia meant to him. Ethan arrived at Mia's school 20 minutes early, a foreign sense of nervous anticipation settling in his chest. He was used to pressure, used to making multi-billion-dollar decisions that could shift markets, but nothing had ever felt as high stakes as this. He spotted Sophia standing near the entrance, her arms crossed as she watched the parents filtering into the school auditorium. When she caught sight of him, something flickered across her face: surprise, skepticism, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of approval. "You're early," she noted. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. "Told you I'd be here?" Sophia glanced at her watch. "Mia's inside with her class. She's been talking about this all week." The weight of those words pressed against Ethan's chest. He had already missed years of firsts. First steps, first words, first everything. But he wasn't going to miss this. "Let's go in," Sophia said, leading the way. The auditorium was buzzing with excitement as families took their seats. Mia's class was set to perform a short play about fairy tales, and as Ethan took a seat beside Sophia, his gaze locked onto the little girl standing on stage, her bright yellow dress standing out among her classmates. Mia scanned the audience, her small face filled with eager anticipation. When her eyes landed on Ethan, her entire expression lit up. She bounced on her toes, waving enthusiastically. Ethan felt something shift deep inside him. He waved back, his throat tightening at the sheer joy in her face. Sophia watched the exchange quietly before murmuring, "That's the happiest I've seen her in a long time." Ethan turned to her, something unreadable in his gaze. "I don't intend to let her down." Sophia studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly, then turned back to the stage. The performance was exactly what one would expect from a group of 5-year-olds, adorably chaotic with forgotten lines and giggles, but to Ethan it was perfect. Mia played a princess who bravely rescued herself instead of waiting for a prince. When her moment came, she stood in the center of the stage, her small hands on her hips, delivering her lines with as much authority as a child could muster. "I don't need saving, I can save myself." Laughter and applause filled the auditorium, and Ethan couldn't help but smile. As the play wrapped up, he felt Sophia's gaze on him. "She's got your confidence," she said quietly. Ethan swallowed. "She's amazing." Sophia exhaled softly. "Yeah, she is." When the play ended, parents flooded the small reception area to greet their children. Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before Mia came running full speed toward him. "You came!" she squealed, launching herself at him. Ethan caught her, steadying her as she wrapped her arms around his neck. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but her trust in him felt like the most precious thing he had ever been given. "Of course I came," he murmured against her hair. "You were incredible." Mia beamed. "Did you see when I fought the dragon?" Ethan smirked. "I did. I think you might be the bravest princess I've ever seen." Sophia watched them, her expression guarded but softer than before. "Mia, why don't you go grab a cookie from the snack table?" Mia nodded eagerly, giving Ethan one last hug before dashing off. The moment she was gone, Sophia turned to him. "You showed up," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan met her gaze. "I told you I would." Sophia hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I'm still not sure what this means. For Mia, for us, but I can see you're trying." Ethan took a step closer, his voice low. "I'm not trying, Sophia. I'm doing this. I'm not going anywhere." Sophia's lips parted slightly, something uncertain flickering in her eyes. Before she could respond, a sudden voice interrupted them. Well, isn't this interesting?" Ethan stiffened, turning toward the source of the voice. His expression darkened as he took in the man standing before them, Victor Lang, his longtime business rival. Victor's smirk was razor-sharp, his gaze flickering between Ethan and Sophia with amusement. "Never thought I'd see the great Ethan Caldwell at a school play. Quite the change of pace from boardrooms and billion-dollar deals." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here, Victor?" Victor shrugged casually. "Networking, of course. Plenty of high-profile families in attendance. You'd be surprised how much influence is built in places like this." His gaze lingered on Sophia just a little too long, and Ethan felt something dangerous coil inside him. "And who is this lovely lady?" Sophia stiffened but remained composed. "Mia's mother," she said evenly. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Ah, I see." He turned back to Ethan, his smirk widening. "Didn't realize you had a secret family, Caldwell. That's a PR nightmare waiting to happen." Ethan's patience was razor-thin. "You're out of your depth, Victor." Victor chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe, but you should know. People are talking about your sudden distraction. The company's board is starting to wonder if your priorities have shifted." Sophia glanced at Ethan, confusion flickering in her gaze, but Ethan didn't take his eyes off Victor. "My priorities are exactly where they need to be." Victor tilted his head, amused. "We'll see about that." With that he strolled away, leaving behind an unmistakable tension. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to push down the anger threatening to surface. Sophia's voice was quiet but sharp. "What was that about?" Ethan shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about." Sophia crossed her arms. "If it affects Mia, I do need to worry." Ethan hesitated before finally saying, "Victor's been circling for months, looking for any weakness he can exploit. Now he thinks he's found one." Sophia's expression darkened. "Because of Mia?" "Because of you," Ethan corrected. "Because I care about something more than work now." Sophia held his gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then I guess we figure out what happens next." Ethan let out a slow breath, knowing that this was just the beginning, because if Victor was involved, the fight for his daughter, and for the life he wanted, was far from over. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. Normally this view gave him a sense of control, of power. But tonight, all it did was remind him how far he had drifted from what truly mattered. The conversation with Victor had rattled him more than he cared to admit. Not because of the threat itself, he had dealt with corporate predators before, but because for the first time he had something to lose beyond money or reputation. He had Mia, and Sophia. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Oliver stepped inside, his usual confident smirk replaced with something more serious. "I heard about Victor." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Let me guess. He's already making moves." Oliver nodded. "He's spreading rumors that you're distracted, that your priorities are shifting. The board is getting nervous." Ethan exhaled slowly. "They'll get over it." Oliver studied him. "Will they?" He paused. "This is different, Ethan. You've always been the guy who lived and breathed this company. The moment they think that's changing, Victor will pounce." Ethan tapped his fingers against the desk. "I'm not walking away from Caldwell Tech." "I know that," Oliver said, "but does Sophia?" Ethan stiffened. "That's not her concern." Oliver sighed. "It will be. If this gets ugly, her name could be dragged into it. Mia's too." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had spent his life shielding himself from vulnerabilities. Now his biggest one was a little girl with bright blue eyes and a mother who still looked at him like she was waiting for him to prove he was different. "I need to handle this," Ethan muttered. Oliver hesitated. "Ethan, you need to be sure of what you want. If you're in this, really in this, you can't half-ass it." Ethan's gaze darkened. "I don't half-ass anything." Oliver smirked slightly. "Then prove it." That evening Ethan arrived at Sophia's apartment. He had barely knocked before the door swung open, and Sophia stood there, arms crossed. "I assume you're here about whatever happened with that guy at Mia's school," she said. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "His name is Victor Lang. He's been after my company for years." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "And now he's using Mia and me against you?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Not directly, but he'll use any weakness he can find." Sophia scoffed. "So we're a weakness?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're the most important thing in my life." Sophia sucked in a breath, but she didn't look away. "Then what happens now?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower. "I protect what matters, you and Mia." Sophia swallowed, her resolve wavering for the first time. "And your company?" Ethan hesitated before saying, "I won't lose either of you." Sophia studied him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You don't get to have everything, Ethan." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Maybe not. But I'm damn sure going to try." Sophia let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Ethan smirked. "You used to like that about me." Sophia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ethan, if this is going to work, if you're really going to be in Mia's life, you need to be sure. She's already attached to you. If you leave—" "I'm not leaving," Ethan interrupted firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Sophia's eyes searched his as if trying to find a crack in his resolve. When she found none, she nodded slowly. "Then prove it." Ethan's lips curved slightly. "I intend to." Ethan had spent his career making tough decisions, ones that affected entire industries, thousands of employees, and billions of dollars. But none had ever weighed on him as much as the choice he faced now. Victor's threats weren't just empty words. They were calculated moves, aimed at exploiting the one thing Ethan had never allowed himself to have, a weakness. And now Sophia and Mia were caught in the crossfire. Sitting in his penthouse, Ethan scrolled through the latest reports Oliver had sent him. Victor had already begun reaching out to board members, sowing doubt about Ethan's leadership. A few anonymous leaks about his personal distractions had surfaced in the press. It was a game of pressure, a test to see if Ethan would break. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. He already knew who it was before he opened it. Sophia stood there, arms wrapped around herself, eyes searching his face. "I shouldn't have come." Ethan stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The door shut behind her, and for a long moment they simply stood there, the silence stretching between them. Sophia exhaled. "I saw the headlines. I know what's happening." Ethan crossed his arms. "I'll handle it." She shook her head. "That's not the point, Ethan. This isn't just about you anymore. If Victor keeps pushing, if this escalates, it won't just be your reputation on the line. It's Mia's future, my privacy, everything." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration rolling off him in waves. "You think I don't know that? I think you haven't figured out how to stop it." Ethan sighed, leaning against the counter. "I have two choices. Fight Victor head-on, which means digging into his dealings and exposing him before he does real damage. Or—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Or what?" Sophia asked, her voice quiet but firm. He met her gaze. "Or I walk away." Sophia's breath hitched. "From what?" Ethan's throat worked as he forced out the words. "From Caldwell Tech." Her eyes widened. "Ethan, that's unthinkable?" He let out a humorless laugh. "I built that company from nothing. But if staying means risking you and Mia getting dragged through this, I don't know if it's worth it anymore." Sophia's expression softened. "And if you step away, what happens then?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "The board will fight it. Victor will still try to take over, but I'll be free to focus on what matters." Sophia hesitated before taking a step closer. "What matters?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for once the answer was simple. "You, Mia, us." Sophia swallowed hard. "Ethan, I don't want to be the reason you give up something you love." "You're not the reason," he said, his voice steady. "You're the reason I'm finally seeing clearly." She shook her head. "You've spent years chasing success. Can you really just walk away?" Ethan ran a hand down his face. "I don't know, but for the first time I'm willing to consider it." Sophia stared at him, emotions warring in her eyes. Finally she whispered, "Then what happens next?" Ethan let out a slow breath. "I go to war with Victor, and if that doesn't work, I step away." Sophia reached for his hand hesitantly. "Are you sure?" Ethan squeezed her fingers lightly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." A beat of silence passed between them before Sophia nodded. "Then let's figure this out, together." Ethan felt something in his chest loosen. He wasn't alone in this, and for the first time in years he realized maybe he never had to be. Ethan had spent years mastering the art of control, but standing in front of Caldwell Tech's board, he realized just how little control he had now. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with suspicion. Half the members were longtime supporters. The others were already aligning themselves with Victor. He could see it in their eyes. The doubt, the questions. The man they had known as a titan of business was suddenly vulnerable, human. And in this world, vulnerability was a weakness. "Let's get straight to it," Victor said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "The company has concerns about your leadership, Ethan. You've been distracted." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "I've been handling personal matters, yes, but that doesn't change my ability to lead." Victor smirked. "That's debatable." He turned to the others. "We've seen the headlines. We've heard the whispers. A CEO who isn't focused is a liability. Investors are nervous." Ethan's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but his voice remained steady. "And yet our profits are up, our expansion is on track, and our market position remains unshaken. You're fishing, Victor." Victor's smirk deepened. "Am I? Or am I just saying what everyone else is afraid to? If your personal matters are more important than this company, maybe it's time to step aside." A murmur ran through the board. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was Victor's endgame, to push him out by turning the board against him. "Let's not pretend this is about company performance," Ethan said coldly. "This is about you wanting my seat." Victor's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Oliver leaned forward. "Ethan's leadership is the reason this company exists. If we're going to discuss his future, then let's discuss the facts, not speculation." One of the board members cleared his throat. "We need assurance, Ethan. If you're truly committed, then prove it." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew what they wanted. Unwavering dedication. A promise that Caldwell Tech was still his #1 priority. But was it? His mind flashed to Mia, to Sophia, to the moment he had told her he was willing to walk away. And for the first time he realized he wasn't willing to choose. He didn't have to. Ethan straightened. "I'm committed to this company," he said firmly. "But I'm also committed to my family, and I refuse to believe I have to sacrifice one for the other." Victor scoffed. "That's not how this works." Ethan leveled him with a cold stare. "Then maybe it's time we redefine how it works." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. Victor had expected Ethan to back down, to reaffirm his loyalty at any cost. But instead he had drawn a line in the sand. "I built this company," Ethan continued, "and I won't let someone like you take it apart for your own gain. If you want to fight, Victor, you've got one." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Be careful what you wish for." Ethan smirked. "I always am." Later that evening, Ethan found himself back at Sophia's apartment. She opened the door, studying him carefully. "How did it go?" she asked. Ethan stepped inside, letting out a slow breath. Victor made his move. I made mine. Sophia tilted her head. "And?" Ethan met her gaze. "I didn't choose. I don't have to." Sophia exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You really believe that?" Ethan nodded. "I do." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's see if you're right." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "We will." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. Ethan knew the fight with Victor wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. And tonight, as he walked into his office, he realized just how far his rival was willing to go. His assistant met him at the door, a concerned expression on her face. "There's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet. Ethan's eyes scanned the screen, and his stomach tightened. The headline was blaring, ruthless. A cold rage spread through him. The article went on to paint a picture of a leader losing his grip, too consumed by personal issues to handle his responsibilities. Anonymous sources, Victor's lackeys no doubt, hinted that the board was considering a shift in leadership. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had expected Victor to play dirty, but dragging his personal life into the public sphere was lower than he had anticipated. Oliver stormed in a moment later, his face grim. "This is bad." Ethan tossed the tablet onto his desk. "No kidding." Oliver crossed his arms. "Victor's feeding this narrative. He's getting the media to do his work for him. If this keeps up, your investors will start backing him instead of you." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had fought corporate battles before, but this time, it was personal. He wasn't just fighting for his company. He was fighting for his future with Sophia and Mia. "We need to control the story," Oliver continued. "You need to go public, make a statement." Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated playing these games, but he wasn't going to sit back and let Victor dictate the narrative. "Set up a press conference, tomorrow morning." Oliver nodded. "And Ethan, you might want to talk to Sophia before this gets worse." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. That was the part he dreaded most. The last thing he wanted was for Sophia and Mia to be dragged into this mess. Sophia was already waiting when he arrived at her apartment. The look on her face told him she had seen the headlines. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, crossing her arms. "Now we're in the middle of a media circus." Ethan stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I'm handling it." Sophia sighed, rubbing her temples. "You can't just handle this, Ethan. This isn't just about you anymore." "I know that," he said, his voice lower now. "That's why I'm not letting Victor win." She looked up at him, frustration and something else, fear, clouding her expression. "And if he does? What happens then?" Ethan reached for her hands. "He won't." Sophia searched his face for a long moment before exhaling softly. "I want to believe you. But if this gets worse, if it starts affecting Mia—" "It won't," Ethan promised. "I won't let it." Sophia hesitated before finally nodding. "Then tell me what happens next." Ethan exhaled. "Tomorrow, I go public with the truth." Sophia frowned. "What truth?" "That I'm not stepping down," he said firmly. "That I can have both, my company and my family." Sophia let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You're stubborn." Ethan smirked. "You used to like that about me." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she squeezed his hands lightly. "Just be careful." Ethan nodded, his determination solidifying. Tomorrow he would take back control. For his company, for Sophia, for Mia. And Victor would finally realize that he had picked the wrong man to push out. Ethan stood in front of the press conference podium, cameras flashing, the murmurs of reporters growing louder as they awaited his statement. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, but he didn't flinch. He was a man used to pressure, used to controlling narratives. But this time, the stakes were different. This wasn't just about his company. It was about his daughter, about Sophia, about proving that he could be more than just the ruthless CEO they had all come to know. Oliver stood beside him, murmuring one last thing before stepping back. "Victor will be watching. Make this count." Ethan adjusted the microphone. "Good morning. I won't waste your time. There's been speculation about my role at Caldwell Tech, about my personal life, and whether I'm still fit to lead this company. Let me be clear. I built Caldwell Tech from the ground up, and I am not stepping down." The reporters erupted in questions, but Ethan held up a hand, silencing them. "However, what I will do is address the rumors about my personal life. Yes, I have a daughter, and yes, I am going to be a father to her." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, cameras zooming in on Ethan's unshaken face. "I have spent my life dedicating every moment to this company. That will not change. But I refuse to believe that being a father and being a CEO are mutually exclusive. Leadership is not just about profit margins and expansion. It's about responsibility, about knowing what truly matters and acting on it." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Caldwell, some investors are concerned about your ability to maintain focus. What do you say to them?" Ethan's gaze hardened. "I say that focus isn't measured by how many nights you sleep in an office. It's measured by results. And unless anyone in this room can argue that Caldwell Tech has suffered under my leadership, those concerns are unfounded." More murmurs, but no objections. Ethan had anticipated every argument, and he wasn't giving Victor any leverage. Another reporter chimed in. "Does this mean you're publicly acknowledging Sophia Reed and your child?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yes, they are my family, and I will protect them." The weight of those words settled over the room. No hesitation, no dodging the truth. Victor had underestimated him. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor Lang watched the press conference from his office, his fingers drumming against the desk. His plan to rattle Ethan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of pushing him out, he had given him the perfect opportunity to solidify his power. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. His assistant hesitated nearby. "What now, sir?" Victor exhaled. "Now?" "We push harder. Sophia had kept the television off all morning, but as she stood in her kitchen, her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. Friends, co-workers, even old acquaintances. Everyone had seen Ethan's statement. Then came the knock at her door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said simply. Sophia crossed her arms. "You just told the entire world about us." "I told them the truth." She let out a slow breath, gesturing for him to come inside. "And now what?" Ethan stepped forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "Now, we see what happens next. Together." Sophia studied him for a long moment before nodding. Maybe, just maybe, he really meant it. Ethan sat in his office, the city skyline sprawling behind him, but his mind was elsewhere. The press conference had been a turning point, but he knew Victor wouldn't back down so easily. His phone buzzed. "Oliver." "We've got a problem," Oliver said without preamble. "Victor just called an emergency board meeting. He's making his final move." Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening on the phone. "When?" "An hour." Ethan grabbed his jacket. "I'll be there." The boardroom was already filled when Ethan arrived. Victor stood at the head of the table, addressing the members with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. "Ethan's distractions have made one thing clear," Victor was saying. "We need stability, and I am prepared to take over as CEO to ensure Caldwell Tech's future." Ethan stepped inside, letting the door shut behind him with a decisive click. "Funny," he said, voice calm but firm, "because last I checked, I'm still the one running this company." Victor turned to him, his smirk unwavering. "Then prove you deserve to." Ethan walked to the table, scanning the faces of the board members. "You all know me," he said. "I built this company from nothing, and despite Victor's claims, Caldwell Tech has only grown under my leadership. So the real question is, do you want a CEO who understands what it takes to lead, or someone who only knows how to manipulate his way to the top?" Murmurs rippled through the board. Victor stiffened, but Ethan wasn't done. "I will not step down," Ethan continued, "and I refuse to let Victor, who has done nothing but try to dismantle what we've built, take what I have worked for." Silence hung in the room. Then, one by one, the board members nodded in agreement. Victor's smirk faltered. "This isn't over." Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, it is." Victor stormed out. Oliver let out a low whistle. That was satisfying. Ethan only nodded. He had won the battle. But now it was time to win something even more important. Later that night, Ethan stood outside Sophia's door. When she opened it, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "It's over," he said. "Victor's out." Sophia exhaled. "And now?" Ethan stepped closer. "Now I focus on what really matters. You, Mia, us." Sophia hesitated, then finally nodded. "Then come inside." Ethan did, and for the first time he knew he was exactly where he belonged. Ethan had always known how to win a battle, but for the first time in his life, victory felt different. It wasn't about power, wealth, or the prestige of Caldwell Tech. It was about walking into Sophia's apartment, seeing Mia's sleepy eyes light up as she ran to him, and knowing, without a doubt, that he had won something far greater than any corporate war. Mia leaped into his arms, wrapping her small hands around his neck. "You came back," she murmured, her voice thick with exhaustion. Ethan held her close, his heart clenching. "Of course I did." Sophia stood nearby, watching, her expression unreadable. But there was something softer in her eyes, something that told him she was starting to believe in him, in this. He carefully set Mia back down, and she yawned, rubbing her eyes. "Are you staying?" Ethan glanced at Sophia before answering. "For as long as you'll have me." Mia grinned, satisfied with that answer, and Sophia sighed, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe this was happening. "Come on, kiddo," she said gently, guiding Mia back to her room. "It's way past bedtime." Ethan followed, standing in the doorway as Sophia tucked Mia in. She smoothed back her daughter's curls, her touch gentle, loving. Ethan had never known this world, this quiet, intimate space where love wasn't earned through deals and power plays, but simply given. He had missed so much, but he was here now. When Sophia stood and walked back toward him, she hesitated. "Want to stay for a while?" He nodded. "I'd like that." They sat on the couch, the apartment dimly lit, the only sounds the occasional hum of the city outside. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This doesn't feel real." Sophia exhaled. "It is." He turned to her. "I meant what I said, Sophia. I'm not walking away." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I know." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You and Mia. You're the most important thing to me." Sophia swallowed hard, her defenses lowering. "You scared me, Ethan. I wasn't sure if you could do this, if you could balance both worlds." He squeezed her hand. "I'm still learning, but I want to. For both of you." She nodded, her eyes shining. "Then we'll figure it out together." Ethan leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. Together. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing after something he couldn't define. He had found it. He had found home. 1 year later, Ethan stood in the backyard of the brownstone Sophia and Mia now called home. The summer sun cast a warm glow over the small gathering of family and close friends. Laughter and conversation filled the air, but Ethan's focus remained on the two most important people in his life. Mia ran toward him, her curls bouncing as she threw her arms around his waist. "Daddy, come see! Mommy made a cake!" Ethan still felt a jolt whenever he heard that word. Daddy. It had taken time, patience, and so many moments of proving himself. But now it was second nature. He ruffled her hair. "A cake, huh? Should I be worried?" Mia giggled. "Mommy says it's perfect. I helped." Ethan glanced at Sophia, who stood on the patio, watching them with a smile. There was a lightness to her now, a confidence in their future that hadn't been there before. He walked over, slipping his arm around her waist. "So, is this famous cake as good as she claims?" Sophia smirked. "Better." They stood there for a moment, watching as Mia ran back to play with her friends. Ethan took a deep breath, letting it sink in. He had a family, a home, a life that wasn't just about power and success, but about love, laughter, and the small moments that made everything worth it. "I still can't believe this," Ethan admitted quietly. Sophia turned to him, her expression soft. "Believe it. You earned it." He kissed her forehead, pulling her closer. "I love you." She smiled. "I love you too." Mia ran back, grabbing their hands and tugging them toward the cake table. "Come on. It's time to eat." Ethan laughed, letting himself be pulled along. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't running toward success. He was right where he was meant to be. Home.